According to a shocking turn of events that no one saw coming, Corey Harrison, the son of Pawn Stars Rick Harrison, has decided to cut all ties with his father. The reason for this sudden action is an unbelievable discovery under the family's mansion that has shaken their relationship and the public's view of Rick Harrison's empire. Rick Harrison's name has long been associated with the world-famous pawn shop he built. Millions of people watched his reality TV show, but there was a darker side to this busy family business. An empire built on high-value antiques and unexpected treasures had its secrets buried deep in the ground it stood on for years. Corey Harrison, Rick's son, had watched as his father became famous and wealthy, but he had a sneaking suspicion that something wasn't quite right. Little did he know that his father's hidden past would soon come out in the most unbelievable way before our eyes. Please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell to get updates. It all began with a simple curiosity and a growing suspicion in Corey's mind. As a child, Corey had always admired his father's ability to turn a deal into a fortune. The pawn shop was a family business, and Rick was the undisputed king of deals. But as Corey grew up and became more involved in the business, he started to notice small things that didn't seem important, but were enough to make him suspicious. What Corey didn't know was that his suspicions were about to lead him down a path that would destroy everything he thought he knew about his father. The mansion that had once been a sign of their success and a grand estate where the Harrisons lived in luxury would become the setting for a terrifying discovery. It was a discovery that would not only change Corey's life, but also reveal a web of corruption, betrayal, and manipulation. It wasn't long before Corey knew what was going on. Corey Harrison didn't decide to cut ties with his father and reveal the truth lightly. For years, Rick had been more than a father to him. He had also been a mentor, a guide, and the one who taught him everything about the family business. But there was a line that Corey couldn't ignore any longer, and that line was crossed the day he found the files hidden under his father's mansion. At first, it had seemed like a small thing, but it turned out to be a big deal. As part of his new duties, Corey recently inherited a piece of the property and decided to take a closer look at the foundations of the mansion. What he didn't expect to find were hundreds of carefully hidden files in the walls of the house. The papers were yellowed from age and full of detailed notes. They had the names of women and children on them, with their lives reduced to a list of numbers, dates, and addresses of abandoned homes across the country. As Corey looked through the papers, he felt very uneasy. The files had disturbing information that pointed to a well-organized network of human trafficking. The pawn shop, which had once been a place for old coins and furniture, was now shown to be a front for much worse crimes. Rick Harrison, the man who had built an empire on deals, was allegedly involved in something much darker than Corey could have imagined. His father's empire wasn't just about valuable antiques. It was about something else. Corey's hands shook as he looked through the papers. Each one seemed to tell a story of a victim, each one linked to a time and place. What was worse was that these records had been carefully hidden and kept from prying eyes. It wasn't just a few pages. It was a stack. It was a whole network of records spanning years, and Corey's own father's fingerprints were all over it. The discovery hit Corey like a freight train. His world and what he thought he knew about his family were both called into question. The man he had looked up to all his life was now linked to a global human trafficking ring. How could this be? How could his father, Rick Harrison, the star of a family-friendly TV show, be linked to such a horrible crime? Corey's mind was racing with questions. He needed answers, but more than anything, he knew he had to do something. He couldn't let his father's actions go unpunished. The man he had called his father for so many years was not the person he had thought he was. What was Corey to do with this damning evidence? How could he live with the knowledge that the man who had helped shape his life was now the very person who had betrayed everything they stood for? It didn't take Corey long to decide what he had to do. The evidence was too strong to ignore, and it was too dangerous to keep quiet about. So, Corey Harrison did something that would change the course of his life forever. He went to the FBI. His first conversation with the police was tense and full of questions. They didn't believe it could be true that Rick Harrison, the proud owner of the gold and silver pawn shop, was involved in human trafficking. The idea seemed so crazy and out of character with the image of Rick they had seen on TV, but the evidence was undeniable, and the more the FBI looked into it, the more they saw how deep this went. It wasn't just the files Corey had found. It was a network that stretched across continents and involved powerful people and secret operations that had been going on. The FBI started their investigation and found that Rick Harrison wasn't just keeping secret files under his mansion. The pawn shop had been used as a front for human trafficking, a way to launder money and move victims across state lines. This shocking news changed how people thought of Rick Harrison and the whole Pawn Stars franchise. Meanwhile, Corey was in the middle of a media storm for telling the truth about his father's involvement in such a criminal case. People were shocked that he would betray his father in this way and destroy everything Rick had worked for. But for Corey, the decision was never about being loyal to his father. It was about doing what was right and standing up for the victims whose lives had been destroyed by the man he had once trusted. The public's response was mixed. Some saw Corey as a hero who was willing to stand up for justice no matter what, while others saw him as a traitor who had turned his back on his family, for Corey couldn't help but think about the life he had lived for years. He had been Rick Harrison's son and lived in the shadow of the family business. But now he wasn't just the pawn shop heir. He was a whistleblower who had shown the bad side of the world he used to know. In doing so, he had torn his own family apart in front of everyone. Corey knew that the effects of his actions would be far-reaching. His relationship with his father was broken for good. Although he would never be able to look at Rick the same way again, what really scared him was the thought that this was only the start. There was more to find and more people to save. The investigation was far from over, and the real question now was what would happen to the Harrison family name once the full extent of Rick's actions were known. The truth was buried under the mansion, waiting to be found, but Corey knew that his journey was just the start. He knew the road ahead would be long and full of challenges and betrayals, but one thing was clear. He had chosen to fight for what was right, and he was ready to face it head-on. It was a quiet evening when Corey Harrison's world was about to be turned upside down. The mansion had always been a safe place for the Harrison family. It wasn't just a home, it was a symbol of their success, their hard-earned wealth, and their reputation as reality TV stars. The house had become a symbol of luxury. For Corey, it was also a place where questions started to grow, where strange things started to come to light, and where unease about his father's empire started to take hold. Corey had been spending more time at the mansion lately. His life had taken an unexpected turn after his involvement in the pond business became more complicated. As Rick's son, Corey had always been in the spotlight, but at 35 years old, the pressure of running the family business was starting to get to him. There was a clear heir to the Harrison family legacy, but he was starting to question everything. The pawn shop, the TV show, and the money that came with it didn't feel as fulfilling as it used to. He had seen how much his father had suffered over the years as Rick became consumed by the business, and Corey was starting to see a side of him that he had never understood before. It wasn't just the constant deals or the cameras. It was something deeper that Corey couldn't put his finger on. Corey first found something that didn't belong while going through old paperwork in the library of the mansion. He had been given the job of going through some of his father's old files from the early days of their business, before the cameras and the fame. Among the mess, Corey found a hidden compartment under the floorboards that he had never seen before. At first, he thought it might have been a mistake, a relic from the past that had been forgotten, but when he opened it, he was shocked. Corey was greeted by a thick stack of files neatly organized in old manila folders. His curiosity got the best of him, and he started to look through the documents. Some were dated back years, while others were more recent. The more he read, the more uneasy he became. The names, dates, and locations of the places all seemed off. At first glance, these papers didn't seem to belong in a mansion like this. They weren't about antiques or pawn transactions, and they had nothing to do with Rick's legal business, no. These were not people looking to sell their old furniture or vintage collections. The names on the files were those of victims. Corey was shocked to realize that these were lists of people, with their names and personal information carefully written down. But it wasn't just names. The files also had addresses, dates, and detailed notes about the people on them. Some of the notes were written in shorthand, while others described specific places where victims had been taken. Some of the addresses were ones Corey knew from his childhood, but others were much scarier. The files seemed to cover multiple states and even countries. As Corey looked through the files, his hands started to shake as the truth started to sink in. What had his father been involved in? Was this some kind of sick joke? Could Rick really be linked to something so disgusting? His mind raced as he tried to make sense of the stacks of papers in front of him. There was no denying what he had found. Discovered was much darker than anything he had imagined. As he read on, he started to see a disturbing pattern. These victims weren't just random ones. They were part of a larger network that stretched across states and even countries. The more Corey read, the more it became clear that his father's business wasn't just about pawn deals. It was a front for something much more evil. The pawn shop, which had always been a family tradition and a seemingly innocent business, Corey couldn't believe that the names and addresses in the files were connected to his father's world. It was as if Rick had run the whole operation from the shadows, using his business to launder money and hide his tracks. Corey's heart was racing. How could Rick, the man he had known and looked up to his whole life, be involved in something so horrible? It didn't make sense. It wasn't just the names and addresses, it was everything. These documents were kept secret from everyone because Rick had gone to great lengths to make sure they were not seen. Corey could feel his anger rising, but he was also scared. What had he just found out? How far did this go? Was Rick the only one involved, or were others? These were questions Corey didn't want to face, but he knew he had to. As he dug deeper into the files, he found more proof of Rick's guilt. The documents listed the names of people who had been taken, moved, and sometimes even sold, along with the dates and places where they had been moved, all while the transactions seemed legal. It was scary to think that the Harrisons' pawn shop, where people had trusted them for decades, had been used as a front for such a criminal enterprise. This news hit Corey like a ton of bricks. Everything he thought he knew about his father was coming crashing down around him. Their family was now being questioned. Rick wasn't just the man who made Corey proud to be his son. He was also said to be a part of something much darker, a network that destroyed lives, a system that had been hidden in plain sight for years. Corey knew he couldn't ignore this discovery. The truth was in front of him and there was no going back. The evidence was solid. It wasn't just a few scattered papers. It was a well-thought-out plan that was carried out. The pawn shop, which had been the foundation of their success, was actually a front for something much more dangerous. But what was Corey supposed to do with this information? How could he reveal the man who had raised him, the man he had admired his whole life? Would he ruin the Harrison name forever? It hurt so much, but Corey knew he had to do something because he couldn't live with the fact that these crimes had been committed in his own home in his father's name. Even though the truth was right in front of him, Corey made the choice that would change everything. He knew he had to take these papers to the police and tell everyone what his father had been hiding. It was the only way to break the cycle and protect the people whose lives Rick had ruined. But as he made that choice, he felt fear. What would happen to his family? What would happen to his friends? Corey Harrison was afraid of what would happen to his relationship with Rick and to their business empire if he took the first step into a world of truth, betrayal, and justice. When he decided to take the files to the FBI, his whole life changed. He wasn't ready for what he was about to find when he walked into the mansion that night. The documents were hidden in a compartment under the floorboards, waiting for someone brave enough to open it. Uncover them, but the truth always finds a way to come out, whether we're ready for it or not. And Corey Harrison was not ready. As the gravity of the situation set in, Corey had to face a truth that broke his heart and soul. The father he had known, the man who had raised him and taught him the ways of the pawn business, was not the person he had thought he was. Rick Harrison, the beloved star of Pawn Stars, was at the center of a network of exploitation, manipulation, and violence that had been going on for years under the guise of a legitimate business. This discovery did more than destroy Corey's image of his father. It destroyed his sense of identity, his family, and everything he had ever known. The emotional toll of this realization is impossible to overstate. For years, Corey had looked up to Rick, admiring his strength in negotiating, his ability to build a successful empire from the ground up, and his advice on how to handle the complicated parts of life and business. As a child, Corey had always seen his father as a guide, a protector, and a leader. They had a respectful and admiring relationship, with Rick often serving as a role model for his son in more ways than one. Corey had spent years living in the shadows of Rick's legacy, learning from him, trying to make him proud. But now that he had the proof, everything was falling apart slowly, and he felt helpless to stop it. The love and trust he had for his father were gone. Instead of love for his father, Corey felt a deep, piercing sense of betrayal. Rick, who had always told him that family was everything, had built his success on lies. The relationship they had had was based on lies, and the man Corey had called his father was at worst a criminal and at best someone who had ignored the suffering of many people for the sake of making money. As he sat there, his hands still shaking from shock, Corey had to make a choice. He had to make a choice that no child should ever have to make. How could he expose his father for the monster he was said to have become? How could he turn in the man who had raised him and taught him everything about the business they had worked together for years? Rick had been more than just Corey's father. He had also been a guiding force and someone he could always count on for advice and protection. But now that he had found out the horrible truth, Corey's whole view of his father had been shattered, and with that came and the next few days were a blur of emotions as Corey tried to process what he had found. He spent sleepless nights tossing and turning in his bed, replaying everything that had happened the moment he opened the compartment. As he read the files, he felt an overwhelming sense of horror and kept asking himself why his father had done this. How could someone who seemed so caring and invested in his family's success be capable of such terrible things? During those long hours of doubt and anger, Corey found himself questioning not only his father's actions, but also his own part in everything. Had he missed the signs? Had he been so focused on the business and the fame that he hadn't seen the dark truth lurking beneath the surface? These questions kept popping up, making it hard for him to focus on anything else. He felt betrayed by both his father and himself. How could he have done what he did? Corey was struggling with these feelings and started to pull away from his family. His relationship with his father, which had been so strong and meaningful before, was now strained and broken beyond repair. Corey found it harder and harder to face Rick every time they talked because he was reminded of the man his father had become, the man who had been hiding a terrible secret for so long. And every time Corey looked at Rick, he saw not the father who had raised him, but a man who had become his father. Corey wanted to go back to a time when everything was easy and his only goal was to learn how to run the family business and make Rick proud. But now that he knew his father was involved in a criminal enterprise, that dream seemed impossible. Corey felt trapped in a nightmare where there was no easy way out. He couldn't act like everything was fine. He couldn't ignore the files, the victims, or the undeniable truth that his father had been living a double life. As Corey struggled to deal with the emotional weight of his discovery, he found comfort in the few people who stood by him, those who knew Rick's darker side but had kept quiet for years. These few allies, though few and far between, became his only source of comfort and understanding. They too had been manipulated by Rick and knew the pain of betrayal, but even with the Corey had to face a harsh reality. Telling the world about his father's crimes would cost him everything. His relationship with Rick would be ruined forever. His place in the family business, which had seemed so safe before, was now uncertain, and the media would be watching them all the time. People who had once admired the Harrison family would now question everything they had built. Corey knew that by telling the truth, he was signing his own death sentence for his relationship. Even though it hurt Corey a lot emotionally, he knew he had to do what was right and bring his father to justice, no matter what. The victim's suffering, pain, and destruction was more important to him than the relationship he had with Rick. He had promised himself that he would never be involved in exploiting others, even if it meant breaking up the family he had grown up in. In the weeks that followed, Corey threw a party to honor his promise. As Corey worked with the FBI to find out all of Rick's crimes, he started to feel like he had a purpose, a reason to keep going, even though he was going through a lot of emotional ups and downs. But as the investigation went on and more information came to light, Corey still couldn't get rid of the grief that was following him around. The pain of losing his father not to death but to the truth would always be with him, and there were times when he wanted to give up, when he sometimes wondered if he had made the right choice. But then he would think of the people who had been hurt by Rick's actions, and the choice would become clear again. He had to keep going. He had to be the one to expose the truth, no matter what. Corey's emotional journey wasn't just about exposing his father's crimes. It was about finding the strength to do what was right even when it cost him too much. In the end, it wasn't just his father who had been hiding the truth. It was also Corey who had been hiding from. It was a painful reality that the man he had loved and trusted had done terrible things. But the truth always finds a way to come out, and Corey knew in his heart that he had made the right choice, even though it hurt. The man he had once admired was gone, replaced by the truth, and it was this painful and devastating truth that would set him and the other victims of his father's actions free. Corey Harrison never thought that the path he was about to take would lead to exposing the man who had been his father. As Corey dug deeper into the files, the extent of what his father had been hiding became clearer and more upsetting every day. Rick Harrison, the face of Pawn Stars and a popular reality TV star, had been living a double life that Corey could no longer ignore. As much as it hurt him, Corey knew that the public had to know the truth. The pawn shop had always been Rick's pride and joy. It was the center of his public image. It was the source of his fame. It was where strangers brought their treasure hunters hoping to make a deal with Rick, the smart and charismatic patriarch of the gold and silver pawn shop. On TV, Rick was shown as a successful businessman who had made his money through hard work and an eye for valuable items. He was a symbol of success and the American dream, but Corey found out the truth, which painted a much darker picture. As he read the documents in the hidden compartment under the mansion, he realized that the pawn shop was anything but a beacon of the shocking discovery, was something Corey could never have planned for. It wasn't just a small crime going on in the background. It was a full-on operation that had been going on for years right in front of the public, the police, and even Rick's closest friends and family. The more Corey looked at the files, the more he realized how involved his father had been. It wasn't just the trafficking itself. It was the whole network that had been running it. Using the pawn shop as a front to launder money, transport victims, and set up a system of exploitation that crossed borders, Rick Harrison, with all his charm and business sense, was allegedly planning this from behind the scenes, using the very business he had made famous for a much darker purpose. At first, Corey couldn't believe it. The man he had grown up with and learned everything about business had been involved in such horrible things. But as the evidence mounted, there was no doubt. Corey kept denying the truth as he read through the files, names, locations, and dates. The documents showed how deeply Rick was involved in the human trafficking ring. The operation was huge, spanning from Nevada to other states and even other countries. Victims were being moved across the country in plain sight, with Rick's involvement sealing their fate in the dark world of exploitation. The pawn shop, which had once been a symbol of honest trade, had become just a front behind the scenes. Corey couldn't help but wonder how long this had been going on, and if he had ever been involved in these crimes, even if he didn't mean to. Could working for the family business have helped his father hide this network? As he thought about the victims, he realized that the names on the files weren't just numbers or statistics. They were real people with real lives, real stories, and real pain. The files painted a grim picture of how these victims had been manipulated. Some were forced into situations they couldn't control. Others were taken from their homes or sold into the network by family or friends. Traffickers, including Rick, used the pawn shop to move the women around the country while hiding them from view. The pawn shop, which used to be a place where people went to sell their things, had turned into a dark hub of crime. Corey couldn't understand how his father had been able to keep his two lives separate. The public persona of a successful businessman and the private life of Rick had built his empire on lies, using the pawn shop as a front to hide his real business. What was even scarier was realizing that Rick had been able to get his whole family, including Corey, to be involved in the scheme whether they knew it or not. For years, Corey had worked with his father and trusted him completely. They shared stories, business tips, and hopes for the future. But now that this has been revealed, Corey no longer trusts his father. Corey's relationship with his father had always been based on trust, but now that trust was broken beyond repair. Corey felt deeply angry and betrayed. How could his father have kept the secret from him for so long? How had Rick been able to hide something so horrible from everyone while keeping up the image of the loving, successful businessman on TV? As Corey dug deeper into Rick's involvement in the trafficking ring, he found even more evidence. Rick was part of a larger group of criminals working with other powerful people in the underground world. The trafficking ring wasn't just based in the pawn shop. It was a well-oiled machine that operated in multiple states with many covert operations and went on for years without being caught. The files had detailed information about where the victims were being held, when they were moved, and who was responsible for transporting them. The pawn shop had been used as a clearinghouse, a place where criminals would move victims from one place to another and decide what would happen to them. The size of the operation was shocking, and Corey realized that this was about more than just his father. Rick had been a small part of a much bigger machine that had been taking advantage of people for weeks. Corey looked over the files, trying to make sense of everything he had found. The evidence was clear, and the more he learned, the more disgusted he became. Rick had lied about his business, using the pawn shop's success to hide one of the most sneaky crimes in history. Corey felt like the ground had been pulled out from under him. The life he had built with his father's help had been based on lies, and now it was all coming to light in the worst way possible. The emotional weight of the discovery was almost too much for Corey to bear. How could he have been so blind? How could he have trusted his father so completely? When Corey found out what Rick had been doing behind the scenes, he felt a huge amount of guilt and shame. He wondered if he had been involved in the operation, and if his actions had helped hide the truth. He felt deeply betrayed, not only because of what his father had done, but also because of the part he had played in the cover-up. As much as Corey wanted to hide the truth, he knew he had to tell what Rick had done, no matter what the cost to the people who were being trafficked. People had been hurt for too long, and Corey couldn't let his father's actions go unpunished. The world needed to know what Rick Harrison had been hiding all these years, and Corey owed it to the victims and to himself to make sure the truth came out. The dark side of Rick Harrison's empire had been exposed, and everything Corey had known about him had fallen apart. The pawn shop, the family business, and Rick Harrison's public persona were all lies, but the truth had finally come to the surface, and there was no going back. But Corey knew that this was just the start of a long and painful journey. He knew that exposing his father's crimes would have huge consequences, but he had no choice but to go on it. As the gravity of Corey's discovery set in, the reality of what he had found became much more complicated. Corey knew that exposing his father, Rick Harrison, and the network of criminal activities connected with the pawn shop wasn't a simple matter. It was time for the police to take action, but he knew the investigation would be both delicate and dangerous. What he had found wasn't just a family betrayal, it was the key to a huge criminal operation that went far beyond the gold and silver pawn shop. Corey's decision to give the documents to the FBI was the first step, but the real work had just begun. The human trafficking ring had been running for years, hiding in plain sight and crossing state lines. The operation was so big that it crossed international borders, and the more Corey told the FBI, the deeper the plot went. Corey's first meeting with the FBI was tense. He sat in a small, plain room at a local FBI office, feeling the weight of what he was about to say. Two experienced investigators who had worked on cases involving human trafficking before listened carefully as Corey showed them the files. He had spent days organizing the papers and sorting through names. Even with his careful attention to detail, he knew the FBI would have to do a lot more to connect the dots. As Corey laid out the evidence, the room seemed to close in on him. The documents weren't just incriminating, they were explosive. Each page showed more than just criminal activity. It showed a network of people who had been exploited, forced into servitude, and moved like cattle across state lines. The pain and suffering shown on those pages were horrifying. The unbelievable events that happened were real, and Corey's father was said to have helped plan them all. The FBI agents were quiet as they took in the information that Corey had just given them. The room was so quiet that it seemed like everyone knew how important it was. Finally, an agent named Sarah Williams spoke up. "Corey, what you've given us is more than enough to start an investigation. But this is bigger than you think. Your father wasn't working alone. We'll need to pull in multiple." Corey nodded, feeling both relief and dread. Relief that the truth was finally out there, but dread at what lay ahead. He had no idea how deeply Rick was involved, or how many lives had been affected by his father's actions. He was about to find out. The FBI began their investigation into Rick Harrison and the pawn shop almost right away. The first step was to look over the documents Corey had given them. The agents knew that the names, dates, and locations were just the tip of the iceberg. The FBI had their work cut out for them because they had to find the people involved in the trafficking ring, identify the victims, and figure out how the pawn shop had been used to help the operation. One of the first pieces of evidence they looked at was the list of victims. Many of the names Corey had found were new to him, but a few stood out. These were the names of women and children who had been sold or moved on certain dates. Some of these people had been moved from one pawn shop to another, while others were hidden in different places across the country. The FBI started contacting local police in the states and cities where these locations were listed in order to find out more about the victims and where they were. As the investigation went on, FBI agents found a series of encrypted emails and phone records that connected Rick to several known human trafficking rings. These connections went beyond the pawn shop, and the FBI had reason to believe that Rick had been involved with organized crime. Organized crime groups, many of which worked across borders. The pawn shop was used as a front to launder money and move victims between countries. What began as a small-scale investigation into one man's criminal activities had grown into a much bigger operation with global effects. The agents also found that Rick had been using a network of accomplices, some of whom worked in the pawn shop and others in other parts of the business. These people had played key roles in making from finding victims to setting up transportation. The more information the FBI got, the more they realized this was a land operation with many layers of lies to avoid being caught. The FBI forensic team worked hard to look at the pawn shop's records and compare transactions with the names on the lists. They found that many of the victims had been bought or sold through the pawn shop, often using fake names or documents. These transactions had been processed, just the victims were moved out of sight and hidden in different places, sometimes for years. As the investigation went on, questions remained about how Rick had run this network for so long without being caught, and how he had kept up the appearance of a legitimate businessman while running a human trafficking ring in the background. The FBI knew that to fully understand the scope of the operation, they needed to look deeper into Rick's personal life. One of the most telling things they found was when the FBI subpoenaed Rick's personal bank records. They found a series of large, unexplained transactions. Money had been transferred to offshore accounts, often in small amounts, but over time, these transfers added up to millions of dollars. The money was traced to shell companies, many of which were set up in foreign countries with weak financial regulations. The FBI thought that this money was being funneled through pawn shops' accounts, which would help them catch the criminals. There were red flags about more than just the financial transactions. The timing of some of the transfers, which happened at the same time as moving victims, suggested that Rick was using the money from the trafficking ring to fund his empire. The money wasn't just going to keep the pawn shop open, it was going to fuel a much darker business. As the investigation grew, the FBI started to question more people who had worked with Rick over the years. Some people were willing to talk about their roles in the trafficking ring, but others didn't because they were afraid of being punished. One of Rick's former employees, David Monroe, turned out to be a key witness. Monroe had worked closely with Rick for years and helped to manage the pawn shop's finances. He told the FBI how Rick had set up the shell companies and used them to move money across borders. Monroe also said that Rick had been in touch with known criminals in Eastern Europe and South America, people with ties to human trafficking rings in those areas. The FBI started to unravel a global web of crime that connected Rick to drug cartels, international trafficking operations, and money laundering schemes. What had seemed like a local case at first was now part of a much larger criminal network with far-reaching effects. The FBI knew they had to move quickly with each new discovery because the stakes were getting higher. Rick Harrison had built an empire on lies, deception, and human suffering, but finally the truth was coming out, and the FBI was going to see it through to the end. For Corey, the investigation had become a double-edged sword. On the one hand, he was glad that the truth was being found, but on the other, he was horrified by how involved his father was. As the FBI closed in on Rick, Corey had to watch from the sidelines, torn between wanting justice and the pain of losing the father he used to admire. He had helped bring Rick's crimes to light, but it had taken a toll on him emotionally. The FBI investigation wasn't over yet, and Corey knew that the road ahead would be long and full of problems. But as the evidence grew and the investigation picked up speed, one thing became clear. The truth was out there, and Rick Harrison would be held responsible for what he did. The moment Corey Harrison decided to tell everyone about his father, Rick Harrison, he knew that his life would never be the same. It was one thing to find a dark secret inside his own home, but it was another to tell everyone about it. Sharing that secret with everyone was a whole different story. What had started as a private betrayal that Corey could hide in the back of his mind was now a public spectacle. The decision was final. The files were given to the FBI, the investigation was underway, and now Corey had to deal with the consequences that were sure to come. Corey sat in front of a computer late one night, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He knew that soon everyone would know about his father's criminal activities thanks to the files he had given to them. The documents found under Rick's mansion were not just papers. They were the key to years of abuse of secrecy and betrayal. When the information started to get out, the media storm that followed was unlike anything Corey had ever imagined. He hadn't planned to go public with his father's crimes. He had hoped that the truth would stay hidden and that he could make peace with the horrible truth of what he had found and move on without. He knew he had to kill his father. But the pain of the victims and the innocent lives torn apart by his father's actions were too much for him to bear. The guilt was too much, and the only way Corey could live with himself was to bring down Rick Harrison's empire. It wasn't just about justice for the victims. It was also about Corey reclaiming his own sense of right and wrong by cutting all ties with a man who had betrayed him and many others. So Corey the Meteor reacted quickly and strongly to Corey's story, which became headline news across the country. People were shocked and couldn't figure out how to connect the image of the beloved pawn shop owner with the man accused of running a human trafficking ring. Ping Pong stars had made Rick Harrison famous, and now the truth was threatening to destroy everything he had built. People had seen Rick negotiate deals with eager customers on TV, laughing off deals with a smile and an easygoing attitude. People saw on TV had a different personality from the person Corey knew in real life. The media made Rick look like the victim of a sophisticated smear campaign, but for people like Corey, there was no going back. The truth was out. The consequences of Corey's choice were immediate and widespread. The press asked him how he could have revealed his father in such a way. Didn't he care about the man who had raised him? Was this all for the money and fame? As soon as Corey stepped into the spotlight, cameras were everywhere, recording his every move. It was a life he had never wanted, one where his private problems were now on display for everyone to see. At first, Corey tried to keep a low profile by avoiding the cameras and blending into the background. But as the investigation went on, and the FBI learned more about Rick's role in the trafficking network, the pressure on Corey grew. The media portrayed him as both a hero and a villain to some. Was a brave whistleblower who had told others about his father's dark secrets for the greater good. He was also a traitor who had destroyed his family for personal gain. Corey's mixed feelings were made worse by the public's opinion. On the one hand, some praised him for being brave, for standing up to his father and telling the truth, no matter what. They saw him as a victim, stuck in an impossible situation, who had made the right choice despite the overwhelming odds. People who supported Corey saw him as a man of justice who was willing to give up everything for what was right. On the other hand, people who didn't like what he did saw him as a man who had betrayed his family for attention and used his father's downfall to further his own career. These critics flooded social media, calling Corey a self-serving opportunist who had taken everything from the man who gave him everything. The divide was clear, and it seemed like Corey there were no answers to the questions that kept bothering him. Was he a hero or just a man whose moral compass had been shattered by one terrible discovery? For Corey, the worst part of the fallout was how it affected his family. His relationship with his father, which was already strained by the truth about Rick's actions, had completely broken down. Rick, who had once been a strong and authoritative figure in Corey's life, was now a shadow of himself. Struggling to keep any semblance of Rick's empire fell apart because of public ridicule, investigations, and press conferences. He was a broken man, and Corey felt the weight of that. Every conversation they had was full of tension, guilt, and resentment. There was no love left between them, only the bitter remains of a relationship that had been destroyed by lies. Corey also noticed that his relationships with other family members were changing. His mother, who had always been there for Rick, was caught in the middle of the fight because she didn't want to believe as more evidence against her husband came to light. She couldn't ignore the truth. Their once strong marriage had broken down, and she had to face the fact that her husband wasn't the man she thought he was. The tension between them was palpable, and Corey felt bad for putting his mother in a position where she had to choose between being loyal to her husband and telling the truth. But his decision to expose his mother affected more than just his immediate family. Rick's crimes shocked everyone in the Pawn Stars community. The show had made stars of Rick, Corey, and Chun-Li, and now the scandal was engulfing the family. There was no way to avoid the fallout. The cast of the show, who had once been close, found themselves at odds with each other. Chun-Li, who had always been close to Corey, was torn between standing by Rick, who had been like a father to him, and supporting his friend. The rift between the two men grew wider every day. It wasn't clear if they would ever be able to get along again. The network that showed Pawn Stars was also caught in the middle of the scandal. The show, which had been one of the most popular reality TV shows, was now mired in scandal, and advertisers pulled their support. The show's future was uncertain, and producers were under a lot of pressure to distance themselves from the Harrisons and the criminal activity that had come to light. Corey saw his family's legacy fall apart in front of his eyes. When people found out about what happened, the pawn shop lost its pride and became a symbol of everything that was wrong. As the public backlash continued, Corey found comfort in one thing: the knowledge that he had done the right thing. Despite the pain, the heartbreak, and the ridicule, Corey knew that he couldn't let his father's actions go unpunished. The victims of the human trafficking ring had suffered long enough, and if his actions led to justice for them, then it was worth it. The road ahead would be hard. Long legal battles, media scrutiny, and personal loss lay ahead, but Corey could not go back. The truth had been revealed, and he would now do everything in his power to make sure that those responsible for other people's suffering would be held accountable. Corey's public expose set off a chain of events that would forever change the course of his life. It was no longer about the pawn shop, the TV show, or the family business. It was about justice for the victims and Corey reclaiming his own sense of who he was. As the storm over Rick Harrison's criminal involvement grew stronger, the media frenzy reached a boiling point. Rick Harrison, who had been a beloved character on Pawn Stars, was now the subject of every headline as a man vilified by the public for his alleged ties to a human trafficking ring. What had been a thriving empire built on business acumen, charm, and a well-known TV persona was falling apart under the weight of criminal accusations, and Rick Harrison was at the center of it all. Would he give in to the pressure, or would he try to fight back against the accusations that could ruin his life? For Rick, the first thing he had to do was deny everything. His carefully crafted public image was now under direct attack. The media had already portrayed him as the villain, the mastermind behind a criminal operation that crossed borders and destroyed countless lives. But Rick wasn't ready to give up his legacy just yet, so he did what he knew best. He doubled down and denied the charges. Rick found himself the target of a sophisticated smear campaign and a pawn in a much larger plot to destroy him and his family. The man who had been the face of Pawn Stars for over a decade was now in the spotlight for all the wrong reasons. Rick's legal defense team quickly got ready to fight the accusations with all the resources they had available. Rick hired one of the best criminal defense firms in the country, a group known for taking on high-profile cases, and they got to work right away on making a defense strategy that would protect Rick from the overwhelming evidence that had already come to light. Their first move was to discredit the accusations, saying that the files Corey had found were fake and meant to hurt Rick's reputation. They also said that Corey had been manipulated by outside forces and that his accusations were based on personal grudges and family problems. Finally, the defense team said that Rick had no knowledge of the illegal activities that were supposedly going on under his watch. They said that Rick had built his pawn shop as a legitimate business, and that any illegal activities that happened there were the result of dishonest employees who had taken advantage of his trust. They said that Rick was at worst a man who had been tricked by coworkers, partners, and even family members who had used the pawn shop as a front for their own illegal activities. In their eyes, Rick was an innocent bystander, a businessman who had been caught off guard by a plot he could never have seen coming. People found it hard to believe Rick's defense. To many, it looked like he was trying desperately to save what little respect he still had for himself. How could he say he didn't know what was going on when the evidence was so clear? How could a man who had built his life around the pawn shop and run it for years not know what was going on inside his own home? Rick's denial only made people think he was trying to hide the truth and protect his empire at all costs. As the legal battles went on, Rick's public statements became more vehement. He went on TV interviews and spoke out against the accusations in a way that shocked many of his longtime fans. He said that the charges were politically motivated and that some people were using his fame and business to bring him down. Rick also accused the FBI of overreaching and said that the investigation into his life was part of a larger effort to discredit his success. Rick's refusal to accusing him of being involved in the trafficking ring made people dislike him even more. The more he denied the claims, the more people seemed to turn against him. His once loyal fans started to question everything they thought they knew about the famous man. The story that Rick was the victim of a smear campaign started to fall apart as more evidence came to light, including statements from former coworkers and employees who had worked closely with him. During the investigation, the FBI tracked millions of dollars and transfers from Rick's pawn shop to offshore accounts, many of which were linked to known criminal groups. Rick's defense team said that these transactions were just part of a legitimate business, saying that the money was being used for investments and business costs. They denied that there was any connection between the financial transactions and the trafficking ring. The defense said that any connection was just a coincidence, but the prosecution's case was strong. The FBI had found records that directly linked Rick to several people in the trafficking network, including meetings with known criminals who were involved in human trafficking. The financial records showed that money had been transferred from the pawn shop's accounts to pay for costs related to the operation, such as transportation costs and bribes to officials who had helped the movement of the timing of the financial transactions, also suggested that Rick was involved in the trafficking ring at key times, making it hard for his defense team to refute the evidence. Even though the evidence kept building, Rick refused to take responsibility for his actions. His defense team kept making the case that Rick was the target of a plot to destroy him, and that the files found by Corey were either fakes or taken out of context, calling into question the evidence. Arguing that the FBI relied too much on Corey's testimony, and that the investigation had been biased from the start. As the legal proceedings dragged on, so did the media's coverage of Rick's case. The once famous Pawn Stars star was now in the middle of a media circus, with news outlets covering every development, every court appearance, and every statement made by Rick's defense team. It wasn't long before the pressure started to get to Rick. His public appearances became less regular, and his behavior became more erratic. As he became more defensive, he lashed out at reporters and critics, unable to handle the weight of the accusations against him. It was clear that the evidence against Rick was overwhelming. The media had already turned against him, and public opinion had changed drastically. What had been a family-friendly show about treasure hunting had turned into a cautionary tale of greed, corruption, and betrayal. The public's trust in Rick Harrison was broken beyond repair, and his legacy as the Rick's personal life was also in chaos. His relationship with Corey had broken down beyond repair. The father and son, who had once worked together in the pawn shop, were now bitter enemies, their bond broken by the truth that Corey had revealed. The investigation had a heavy emotional toll on Rick. His family, who had been so close, was now split up, and his wife, who had been there for him through the ups and downs of the business, was now left to deal with the consequences of his actions. Rick's mental and emotional health had been hurt by the shame, legal battles, and betrayals he had to go through. As the trial date got closer, it became clear that Rick's defense would have to be more than just denying the accusations. It would have to completely change his image by making him look like the victim of a huge plot. But no matter how hard he tried to distance himself from the accusations, more evidence kept coming in and people kept calling for answers. Rick's lawyers started to prepare as the case against him got stronger. They tried to negotiate a plea deal. They knew that a trial would be a losing battle, so Rick's defense team looked into the possibility of a shorter sentence in exchange for a guilty plea. The decision to go for a plea deal was a turning point in Rick's case. It meant that he would no longer be fighting to keep his innocence. In the end, Rick Harrison's denial of the charges and attempts to distance himself from the human trafficking operation only made things worse. People thought he was guilty, and the once proud star of Pawn Stars had lost his fame, and his name would forever be linked to the crimes he was accused of. As the legal battle went on, it became clear that Rick's reputation would never be the same, and his empire, which had been built on charm, business sense, and a love of old things, was now in pieces. Corey Harrison's expose of his father Rick Harrison and the subsequent legal battles had far-reaching effects not only on the Harrison family, but also on society as a whole. As the investigation into Rick's involvement in human trafficking went on, the legal and moral implications of the case became more complicated. The case showed not only the flaws of one person, but also the systemic problems that let these crimes go unnoticed for so long. For Corey, the emotional toll of revealing his father's involvement was made worse by the moral and ethical questions that came up as the investigation went on. On a basic level, the legal implications of Rick Harrison was facing serious criminal charges, such as human trafficking, money laundering, and conspiracy. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his defense was getting weaker by the day. However, the legal battle was anything but simple. It brought up tough questions about the responsibility of people who work in businesses, the morality of ignoring criminal activity, and the role of family loyalty in the pursuit of justice for Corey. He knew that turning his father into the police was the wrong thing to do, but he had to face the moral difficulties of betraying the person who had raised him. How could he reconcile the love and respect he once had for his father with the knowledge that Rick had been involved in such horrible crimes? How could he justify telling everyone about his father's secrets when he knew that it would ruin not only Rick's reputation, but also the family's legacy? A lot of people thought about family loyalty during the investigation. How loyal should someone be to a family member who is accused of horrible crimes? For Corey, the answer was clear. The victims of the human trafficking ring had suffered for too long, and the truth had to come out. But it came at a huge personal cost. Corey had to deal with the constant attention of the media, the judgment of his peers, and the pain of knowing that his own father was part of a network of exploitation. The case had legal consequences beyond Corey's personal struggle. As the FBI investigation went on, the focus shifted to the trafficking operation as a whole. Rick Harrison seemed to have been just one part of a much bigger system. The trafficking ring had been supported by a web of criminals, corrupt officials, and helpers. The pawn shop, which used to be seen as a legitimate business, had become a key part of a criminal network that crossed state lines. The operation was carefully planned to avoid being caught. Victims were moved from one place to another while remaining hidden, and the pawn shop was used as a front to launder money and help the trafficking operation. The FBI found proof that Rick had been in touch with known criminals who were connected to other trafficking rings in Eastern Europe, South America, and Asia. The more evidence the FBI found, the more obvious it became that this was a worldwide operation. Been able to grow because people in power and authority didn't care. The case raised important moral questions about the role of businesses in stopping crime and how responsible business owners, especially those in power, were for making sure that their companies weren't being used for illegal things. In Rick Harrison's case, the question was made more difficult by the fact that he seemed like a successful businessman who had worked hard for years to get rich. Although he worked hard, the investigation into Rick's pawn shop showed that his business was based on lies, deceit, and the suffering of many victims. The case also had wider legal implications for how human trafficking cases were handled by law enforcement. Trafficking rings often operate in the shadows, making it hard for authorities to track and break them down. The pawn shop's legitimate business operations made it easy for criminals to take advantage of the system. It was a major case in the fight against human trafficking because it showed that stricter rules and better ways of stopping businesses from being used as fronts for illegal activity were needed. During the investigation, one moral question that came up was whether Rick could be fully responsible for the crimes that happened under his watch. His defense team said that Rick was just a businessman who had been ripped off by those around him, and that he had not known the full extent of the Rick thought that any illegal activity was caused by dishonest employees and friends who took advantage of his trust. But the evidence against him showed that he was actually very much involved in the operation, not just watching or listening, but also actively helping the trafficking ring succeed. This made people wonder if Rick knew his pawn shop was being used as a front for trafficking people, or if he was just careless and didn't notice the signs. The prosecution said that Rick knew exactly what was going on and had purposely ignored the warning signs to protect his business and reputation. The defense, on the other hand, said that Rick had been misled by his employees and had been too focused on running his business day to notice the illegal activity going on right under his feet. For Corey, the moral dilemma was personal. He wanted to believe his father was innocent, but the evidence made him think otherwise. He had spent years learning the business and building their empire with Rick, but now that the truth came out, Corey realized that his father had been involved in something much darker than he could have imagined. It hurt so much to know that Rick had been hiding this secret for so long. How could the man who had raised him, taught him, and been like a father figure to him be so cruel? How could Corey reconcile the man he looked up to with the monster who had hurt him? Allegedly ran a human trafficking ring. Rick's case had major legal and moral repercussions. The investigation into his crimes was a wake-up call for many, showing how businesses that could be used as fronts for criminal activity need to be held more accountable. The case also showed how important it is to spot the signs of trafficking and take action to stop it. The pawn shop industry, which had long been seen as a legitimate business, was now under intense scrutiny, changing the public's view of the news about Rick Harrison's involvement in the trafficking network changed the industry forever. For Corey, the moral consequences of what he did were just as serious. He told the world about his father's crimes, even though he knew it would ruin their family and ruin their reputation. But he did it to get justice for the people whose lives were ruined by Rick's actions. This is an ethical dilemma that many people face in tough situations. How do you balance family duty with doing what's best for Corey? The answer was clear. He chose to tell the truth no matter what, because he knew that justice for the victims was more important than protecting his father's reputation. As the investigation into Rick Harrison's role in human trafficking continued, the legal and moral questions surrounding the case would remain at the center of public discourse. The scandal had already changed Corey's life. As a result of Rick Harrison's case, people talked about how businesses should stop criminal activity and how individuals should stand up to wrongdoing. The case had legal and moral effects that would last for years, and the lessons learned from the investigation would help shape how businesses and law enforcement handle cases of human trafficking in the future. Corey Harrison's world had changed in a way that he couldn't fully understand. It wasn't just the media attention or the media frenzy that changed his life. It was the painful realization that the man he had always thought of as his father was not who he had thought he was. Rick Harrison, the star of Pawn Stars and the man who built an empire from nothing, was now at the center of a scandal that would haunt him and his family for the rest of their lives, and Corey was the one who had to deal with this news. As the FBI investigation went on, Corey found it was hard for Corey to decide to tell everyone about his father's involvement in a human trafficking ring. But now that everyone knew the truth, he had to deal with the emotional and psychological effects of his actions. The weight of betrayal, guilt, and grief was something he had never expected. There were times when he wondered if he had made the right decision. He had told everyone about his father's crimes knowing that it would destroy their family. But by doing that, he showed the darker side of a system that had helped his father succeed and gave a voice to victims who had been silenced for so long. But the price was high. Cutting ties with his father was very hard on Corey's emotions, and he often wondered if it was worth it to do the right thing. Corey had spent his whole life admiring Rick Harrison. As a child, he had watched him negotiate deals in the pawn shop and learned how the business worked. Rick had been more than just a father to Corey. He had also been a mentor, a guide, and the person who had shaped his view of the world. They had a strong bond based on years of shared experiences, family moments, and respect for the business they had built together. But when the truth about Rick's involvement in human trafficking came out, that bond was broken. The man Corey had once admired was no longer the person he thought him to be. He was now someone Corey couldn't stand. Corey felt like he couldn't suffocate from the guilt of not knowing the full extent of his father's actions. There were nights when he couldn't sleep because his mind was racing with questions about what he could have done differently. Like, could he have seen the signs earlier or stopped this from happening? He couldn't help but wonder if he had been involved in some way, even if he didn't know it. After all, Corey had been having worked in the family business for years. Had he ignored signs of wrongdoing? Had he been too busy making deals and growing the business to notice what was going on in the background? These questions made him feel bad, and he couldn't get rid of them. But as the investigation went on and the truth became clearer, Corey realized he couldn't blame himself for what his father had done. Rick had made decisions that were his own, and he was responsible for his actions. Rick was responsible for all of his actions. Corey worked in the business, but he had never been directly involved in the illegal activities that Rick planned. The truth hurt, and the betrayal was hard to handle, but Corey knew that he couldn't take the blame for his father's crimes. He knew he had done the right thing by telling the truth, no matter how hard it was. The emotional toll of the situation was made worse by the attention from the media and the public. When he chose to report his father's crimes, he put himself out there for scrutiny and judgment. The press saw him as both a hero and a villain, depending on who you asked. Some saw him as a brave whistleblower who had given up everything to do the right thing, while others saw him as a traitor who had destroyed his family for personal gain. It was hard to deal with all the different opinions, and Corey often found himself wondering if he was really doing this for justice or because he needed attention. As the investigation went on and Rick's legal defense got more desperate, Corey's feeling of being alone grew. He had lost his father's support and was now seen as an enemy by Rick. Rick's anger and resentment toward Corey were clear, and their conversations became more and more tense. What had been a father-son relationship based on trust and respect had turned into a bitter, hostile exchange of accusations and pain. Corey had never imagined that he would have to deal with this situation. When the truth came out, Corey knew he had no choice but to stand up for justice, no matter what the personal cost. The emotional toll of this decision wasn't just about Corey's relationship with Rick. It was also about how it affected his sense of self. For years, Corey had defined himself through his connection to his father and the pawn shop. It was what made him who he was, goal and direction, but now that the truth was out, Corey began to question everything. Who was he, if not Rick Harrison's son?